Good evening, everyone. It's so special to be here in my hometown, and really wonderful to be at East Quay and to see so many familiar faces, some of which I saw on screens during the lockdown lectures. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here and to talk to you in person. And I hope if, as the talk goes on, any questions or comments, it'd be wonderful to hear from you at the end of the talk. So here we go. Don't decorate rectangles. Don't paint to prove an idea. Don't paint to prove what's right. Don't paint to be loved. The point is to dump it. And dump it he did. Philip Guston, the 20th century American heavyweight of paint, refused to settle. At the opening of his controversial show at Marlborough Gallery in 1970, most were shocked and appalled at his change in direction. Crude, cartoon-like paintings had replaced his earlier, celebrated, abstract expressionist works. Gone were the acceptably ambiguous canvases, primed for the critic eager to spraff words of indulgent interpretation across multiple surfaces. Instead, Guston confronted his audience with images, identifiable images, which could not be subverted by semantics. The critics were ill at ease. Gone were the open nets of abstract expressionist painting, which welcomed their creative writing talents. The specific nature of Guston's new works, painted in comic book scrawl, left critics scrambling for a response that was anything but positive. Was it fear? Here were paintings of objects. Objects and things that existed in the world, a world we recognise, a world which is sometimes uncomfortable to look at, a world Guston had seen, and so we too must look. William de Kooning was one of the few to recognise the significance of Guston's new direction. He offered his congratulations and said, "You know, Philip, what your real subject is? It is freedom. The whole idea is for the artist to be free." The most important thing about Guston is his ability to remain free, and this lecture aims to understand why that freedom is so precious and why it is so hard to obtain, let alone keep. Guston had dared to move on from the work that had made him famous. It cost him friends. He was written off by the art establishment. Even Musa, his wife, a most valued creative confidant, was initially unsure of his new direction when she exclaimed, "You're crazy, they're terrible." But Guston had fought to be free, free to be surprised by what he made. He learnt from each movement upon the canvas without knowing the lesson. Creativity is simultaneously what you know and what you don't. Guston describes how when someone does not hear themselves tell the story, well, that's creation. Guston was born in 1913. His Jewish Russian parents fled to Canada from the persecution of pogroms. The family moved to Los Angeles when Guston was 6. His father commits suicide 4 years later. It is Guston who finds him, hanging from the rafters of a shed. Encouraged by his mother, Guston drew continuously, retreating to a cupboard, lit by a single hanging bulb. He copied cartoons from the newspapers, such as Crazy Cat by George Herriman. He won a drawing contest run by the LA Times whilst at high school with Jackson Pollock. Both later got expelled for producing a leaflet that bad-mouthed the English department and criticised the amount of PE that was required. Guston did not return to formal education. He instead formed a social circle of scholars, artists and writers who led him to view the incredible collection of Louise and Walter Arensberg, which included 40 Duchamps and 19 Brancusis in their Hollywood home. Here in his late teens, Guston saw the works of Cubist and Surrealist painters, including Pablo Picasso and Giorgio de Chirico. Throughout his life, Guston would quote the words of de Chirico, wrote in Latin across an early self-portrait. "What shall I love, if not the enigma?" Guston's early works, such as Mother and Child, from 1930, bears the hallmarks of much surrealist painting of the time. Ominous structures of claustrophobic architecture, closing in on the skewed scale of colossal figures. set against a backdrop of blue sky and white clouds. The surrealist melt of materials is seen in the fabric cover over the woman's shoulder and the cloth above the pail of bright blue water, its artificial colour in keeping with the pink hue of the jelly baby-like child, their head nestled not to the breast, but wedged between the gap between limb and torso. And yet, even here, at the age of 17, examples of Guston's familiar visual rhetoric appear. A street lamp, like a hanging bulb, is impossibly tucked into a building. Brickwork, nails, and wood grain describe surface. The sensation of weight and form has already been mastered. The physicality of the figure surely influenced by paintings from Picasso's so-called Roman period, such as Two Women Running on the Beach or The Race from 1922. This work from 1935 further quotes the surrealist vocabulary of stretched shadow, impossible landscapes, and draped fabrics, alongside smooth bodies and mysterious objects. The hanging bulb above a suspended pelvis that casts a heart upon the floor. In reproduction, Guston discovers the works of Giotto, Masaccio, Mantegna, and Piero della Francesca. These early Renaissance masters appealed to Guston for the rest of his life. Their remote, suspended description of form seems so different to later masters, who moved moulded figures with emotion. Guston describes Piero as working like a sign painter, with no flourish. A great lesson, he recalled in 1971. At the start of the 1930s, Guston visited Mexican muralist Jose Clementin Orozco and David Alfaro Sequeires at work in LA. Inspired by the presentation of art as a tool for social change, his works became more politicized. A mural painted in 1931 on the walls of the John Reed Club depicted the Scottsboro case and the horrific crimes of the Ku Klux Klan. It was later vandalized by the Red Squad of the LA police, intent on shutting down any communist activity or criticism of the law. In 1936, Guston joined Jackson Pollock and his brother Sandy McCoy in New York. By now, he was using the name Guston instead of Goldstein. The alteration of his family name was common practice among Jews to minimize the impact of anti-Semitism. After receiving early commissions to paint murals in Mexico and Los Angeles, Guston continued this trade with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, an organization designed to employ the millions of job seekers left over from the Depression. The murals he made reflected his art education thus far, embodying the smooth, stark, shadow-filled style of the surrealist painters, the political power of the Mexican muralists, and the poise and palette of Piero. During this time, Guston is also making easel painting, completing Bombardment in 1937, a response to the obliteration of the town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. The attack was a test of weaponry, considered by many to be a war crime, and was famously immortalized by Picasso in his masterpiece on the same subject. Guston's circular panel is rather crude and somewhat immature in perhaps an unfair comparison to Picasso's effort. So much is thrown at it. Their foreshortened bodies and contorted limbs spiral out from the explosion at the center, which fires up towards the sky filled with booming aircraft. Every inch is covered in action and reaction. The young Guston is yet to make use of the art of obliteration. But by 1941, Guston made what he later described as the first personal painting I painted. Martial memory signals a confident stride forward. The image was recycled from a section of an earlier mural, which showed children fighting, a subject to which Guston felt an affinity, and so carried it forward into his work. In 1973, reflecting back upon this period, Guston recalls how he was trying to make some kind of reconciliation between what I saw in Picasso and Leger and what I felt a kinship to in a painter like Uccello, for example, and Piero della Francesca. The paintings of the 1940s all reference those artists in one way or another. Guston seems to morph himself into Picasso in this haunting self-portrait. Sunday Interior, painted in 1941, alludes to the blank buildings and blue skies of Takiriko. The tilted physics of space awkwardly accommodates an erect figure whose rigid right arm aligns with their tie and cord of the blind. The picture plane runs our eye down the edge of the window, past the sitter's left ear, and out across the table. As Cubism would intend, we are unable to follow a consistent set of rules which combine to create the illusion of three-dimensional space upon a two-dimensional surface. Guston moved out of New York in the early 1940s due to economic necessity. He and his wife Musa settled in upstate Woodstock, welcoming their daughter, also Musa, in 1942. She can be seen right of centre, with a paper crown upon her head in If This Be Not from 1945. The work took a year to complete, perhaps due to Guston's ambition to empty all he had learned and felt onto the canvas. The work has an eerie, dreamlike quality, as if a collection of faded memories are concealing something more sinister. All the faces of the children are covered by masks or obscured in some other way. Even Guston's daughter wears a shadow across her eyes. One masked child rings a bell. Another pulls on a rope, which seems to raise a sail, perhaps of a collective imaginary boat, which bonds the children's play. The paint is heavier, looser, and darker in tone. The ochre door propped up between the background and foreground, with its cartoon-like doorknob, seems to signal things to come. After finishing If This Be Not, Guston felt he had made a pretty complete statement and was anxious to move on. Porch 1 and Porch 2 were painted during a turbulent time, which saw Guston destroy many works, but their survival signals that Guston saw value in them. The figure begins to slide into vertical forms, bodies, plaited hair, shoes, arms, long noses, chairs, the legs of a handstand, rope, and cigarettes are ordered into slats of shape across the painting. A cross made of two planks sandwiches a figure, like string around a parcel. It holds the painting together. The space is shallow. The figure is under threat from pure form. In 1947, Guston paints the tormentors. The hooded figures return, but only in outline and without any tangible presence. Guston is not yet ready for their full-bodied reappearance, which will occur 20 years later. He cuts out and carries across the red from Porch 2, alongside a single plank and the cylinder of the trumpet. All forms are pulled and are pushed up against the picture plane. Guston describes the picture plane as not a physical thing. It is not a material surface. It's totally an imaginary plane, which has to be created by illusions. The interaction with the picture plane is what all painters hope to master, and yet it cannot be taught. It is a mythical film, which one can push back and forth, get under, get in front of, be on the inside or the outside of. But its properties are only discovered through making. Any good painting manipulates the picture plane and does not consider the square or rectangle of the canvas a hole in which to pour one's soul or a surface to cover. It is the creation of another kind of space which moves in the mind. The Tormentors was Guston coming to the canvas without subject matter and seeing what would happen if he just put paint on. Guston's expulsion of the image is also inextricably linked to visits back to New York in 1947, where this method of summoning the subject matter through action upon the canvas was in full swing. Guston was soon back in touch with Pollock and was reacquainted with de Kooning. He also met painters, Robert Motherwell and Mark Rothko. Guston later recalled a mutual studio visit with Rothko, where he said, "Phil, you're the best storyteller around, and I'm the best organ player." That was in 1957. I still wonder what he had in mind. Those also on the scene were painters Joe Mitchell, Franz Klein, Barnett Newman, Lee Krasner, Clifford Still, the poet Frank O'Hara, and the composers Morton Feldman and John Cage. It was the era of what became known as abstract expressionism, or as Guston preferred, the New York School. Like any decent art movement, it centred around a bar, the Cedar Tavern, on the edge of Greenwich Village, where ideas were shared through a cloud of smoke and booze. In 1951, Guston began again with white painting. He set himself the task of just painting without stepping back to observe, criticise, or edit his actions, ending with that feeling of, when it was over, it was over. The discovery was that no matter what he did, there would be structure. And yet, it is not a particularly effective painting. The picture plane is placid. It does not move, and there is little conversation between forms, space, and colour. But it is the act of making that matters, the courage it took to make a work like this, and the direction it signposts. Guston later explained that this was a period of great discoveries for him, approaching the canvas with little preconceptions, perhaps the vague beginnings of a still life, and then the rectangle of the canvas would conjure the grid. The horizontals and verticals emerging from the properties of the surface upon which he worked can be seen in his drawings and his paintings of the time. This is Summer from 1954. You can see the pleasure which comes from the security of marks dictated by a grid. The colour towards the limits of the frame has a fleeting quality, reminiscent of impressionist light, but a heaviness, an anchored mark, is beginning to fizz up and solidify onto the surface. Beggar's Joy, painted shortly after, has lost the atmospheric light. The dominant colours of red and white have been worked together into a muddy pink, punctuated by grey, the odd bit of ochre, and a fuzz of green. By taking a closer look at the surface, you can see how the scraping off of paint is again covered in a frenzied process which at some point runs out. The red, grey mass begins to lift off from the sanctuary of the grid and away from the picture plane, a process further developed in dial. The laboured strokes of obliteration, the erasures, are becoming form. Guston declared that one of the best definitions of painting was from Franz Klein, who said, "You know, painting is like hands stuffing a mattress." A deeply tactile description that makes sense when applied to this period of Guston's work. The paintings feel a bit like a stuffed sock drawer or an airing cupboard jammed with towels and blankets. It's stuff, no longer the rhythm of abstraction, more the rhythm of life. Guston might not know it yet, but the hunt is on. He is abandoning the ambiguity of abstraction for the ambiguity of the image. Drawing, as always, is the catalyst for change. Everyday objects, a shoe, a clock, a knife in a block, are inked across paper, making a net-like construction which appears in the paintings. Earlier stuffings of colour are now caught in a claggy web of black, which begins to stick together, moulding into head-like boulders. The image is hovering outside the door, but Guston is not yet sure how to let it in. This prolific period of painting saw Guston have two major exhibitions, one at the Guggenheim in 1962 and another at the newly refurbished Jewish Museum in 1966. However, Guston falls into despair. His affair with photographer René Ponswald, who took this photo, has come to an end, and he returns to his wife, Musa, unsure of what comes next. A teaching job takes him to Florida, where he begins work on a series of what he later refers to as pure drawings. Sparse black marks on white paper. Describing this time, Guston explains how, out of desperation, I started this. And in fact, when I was doing these lines, I suddenly got a call from Feldman, composer Morton Feldman. "I'm in Texas, come and see me." "No," he said. "Can I come and see you?" And I said, "Please, come." He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm down to one line." And he said, "I'm coming right away." I don't think Feldman, who stops talking to Guston after the Marlborough Show in 1970, needed have worried. It is the painter's form of rehabilitation to go back to a single mark on a surface, to understand the power of placement, the consequence of the speed of a mark, the pressure of the body upon the medium, the creation of space from form and vice versa. The quantity of drawings that Guston destroyed is testament to those that remain, able to communicate an object in space, perhaps an entire face, a landscape, something growing. To go back to so-called basics is to see again, to discover what is possible. Guston describes wanting to paint as a caveman would, when nothing had existed before, whilst also being conscious of the culture of painting. Prompted by Harold Rosenberg, he settled on the ambition to be a civilized first man, a formula for the poet first described by Mallarmé. Guston desired an occasional breakthrough to a kind of innocence, a state where, with all your knowledge and constant analysis, something happens as if for the first time. In 1965, Guston wrote and published a short text called Piero della Francesca, The Impossibility of Painting, in Art News. In it, he explains how Piero is so remote from the other masters, without their completeness of personality. Their completeness of personality, a perfect statement. Yet just like a perfect brushstroke, one is unable to fully explain in words the eloquence of such a statement. Perhaps it is about the lack of melodrama in Piero's work. There is nothing that stands between us and the painting, nothing to subvert us from what is there. Guston puts it better. He describes Piero as without our familiar passions, like a visitor to earth, reflecting on distances, gravity, and positions of essential forms. In reference to Piero's baptism, an image Guston had on his kitchen wall, and a painting we are lucky enough to have in London, he describes how opening his eyes for the first time, trees, bodies, sky, and water are represented without manner. The painting is nowhere a fraction more than the balance of his thought, his eye. One cannot determine if the rhythms of his spaces substitute themselves as forms or the forms as the rhythms. He later reflects that trying to write about Piero's painting was as hard as painting itself, and that what he was doing was writing instead of painting. Nowhere will you read a better piece of writing on the work of Piero. Art historians don't come close. They obscure the artist's intentions with symbolic meaning, whereas Guston lifts the lid on what it means to be a painter, while simultaneously describing to us what he wants to achieve in his own painting. To represent without manner, to have space and forms be interchangeable, these are the ambitions of those who are interested in exploring the limits of the medium they command. There is no Da Vinci Code-like mystery to uncover. It is the purity of untampered creation, to paint the world as if it is seen for the first time. Guston often discussed the work of Piero when teaching, and in the early 1970s he recalls a conversation with students while visiting Piero's Legend of the True Cross in Arezzo. In reference to an image of a man stabbing another man in the neck, a student remarked, "Well, he looks so placid. You wouldn't look like that if you were stabbing somebody." Guston describes how this comment illustrates the remoteness so many of us have from art. We have such a direct way of thinking that it's like a movie way of thinking. That is, if a man is killing another man, he's supposed to grimace. But in fact, here, one of the great things about it is that he's killing this other man as if he's picking a piece of grass in the earth or lifting up a button. So he missed the point. He wanted him to look angry. Guston exposes our sometimes misguided expectations of art, which can make us miss what is right in front of us. We so often head off on a quest to uncover some sensational meaning at the expense of seeing the wonder of what it is that is being seen. It is not so much what is the artist trying to tell us, more what are they looking at? As a painter, Guston understands the motivation behind a mark. He can see when the artist is searching as opposed to merely recording. On Rembrandt, Guston explains, Rembrandt eliminates the plane, anything between that image and you. The Van Dyck hasn't. It says, I'm a painting. The Rembrandt says, I'm not a painting, I'm a real man. But he is not a real man either. What is it then that you are looking at? He also amusingly reflects on the contemporary circumstances of looking. Are we seeing what others see? In reference to a pilgrimage to the remote hilltop town of Urbino to see Piero's flagellation, Guston recalls, you finally get there, and there's somebody else looking at it. Are we looking at the same picture? It took me a day and a half to get there, buses and so on, and the guard stands there and says, that's a Piero della Francesca. Yeah. By 1968, Guston had again drawn himself out of a rut. A new visual language was evolving from the hundreds of pure drawings he had made in Florida. He had come to understand that a line was alive when it made form at the moment of its movement across the surface. Guston did not want to see the illustration of his thought upon the canvas. He knew that the thought should occur during the process of medium to surface. That way, he could be surprised to see it there, because it was not predetermined. The best reaction he could hope for was to walk back into the studio the next day and say, Jesus, did I do that? The point he was working towards was that he didn't do it. It is tempting to discuss Guston in terms of reinvention, but what he achieves is the capacity to reveal something that already existed. He stands aside. We as artists are always the biggest barrier to our own creative freedom. To find a way to create where anything goes sounds simple, but it is much harder in practice. John Cage once famously said to Guston, when you start working, everybody is in your studio. The past, your friends, enemies, the art world, and above all, your own ideas. All are there, but as you continue painting, they start leaving, one by one, and you are left completely alone. Then, if you're lucky, even you leave. This quote seems to illustrate Gustave Courbet's ginormous work, painted 100 years earlier, in 1855. In a letter to a friend, Courbet wrote, to the right are all the shareholders, that is to say, friends, fellow workers, and amateurs from the art world. To the left is the other world of trivial life. The people, misery, poverty, wealth, the exploited, the exploiters, people who live on death. Here we see Courbet at the start of work, perhaps before, one by one, everyone begins to disappear, including himself, leaving only the canvas upon the easel. Experience informed Guston that any result worth keeping was all about the interaction between artist and paint on the surface, not about doing something right, but about reacting to what is there. Up until now, the willingness of new forms onto the canvas had resulted in distortions, which did not survive the testing of Guston's eyes. But finally, he found a way for objects to stay. After years of erasures, which became categorized as abstract expressionism, he finally accepts what he previously painted out. The pure drawings he spewed out in Florida, begin to describe recognizable forms. Guston talks of a fear of specificity, something perhaps many artists feel. There is a safety in ambiguity, where one can find whatever they are searching for. But if specific objects are your bag, you surely have to say something about them when they are there, and why they have come to exist. But the brilliant thing is, Guston found another kind of ambiguity, the ambiguity of everyday objects, but he did something to them. His translation is like no other. Marks start to form into recognizable objects, such as books, which bulge with solid personality. The information they yield translated into mark, whereas the strokes of his last body of work felt so searching, the hand that now creates is confident and at ease. The works that follow this pause from painting in exchange for drawing are, I think, some of Guston's best. Most are roughly 30 by 40 centimetres, and together they form a visual alphabet of reoccurring objects, some of which persist throughout the rest of Guston's career. The palette is restricted to pale blue, ochre, green, orange, black, white, red, and a bubblegum pink that repeats into various forms and spaces. The same marks describe blood, glass, text, windows, nails, stitches. Guston finally unlocks the forms that have been fighting to get out. The images he placed under the cover of abstraction have now changed. When the cover is lifted, something else is underneath, and this time it is allowed to stay. In 1974, Guston explained that some of the images I'm painting now I destroyed 10 or 15 years ago. So it's a question of time, being ready, you might say, to accept. These small canvases seem to be painted without hesitation. They have a solidity and permanence, and yet remain fresh and spontaneous. As intended, they are not the product of an idea or thought. They are made in reaction to the movement of medium on the canvas, as it follows an arbitrary objects Guston referred to as crapola. The paintings are known and yet unknown. These objects we recognise have been translated by paint into something peculiar, yet strangely satisfying. A lot of it has to do with the pressure of one form on another. The cigar slumps on a wall like some kind of fleshy sack, unable to move or lift under its weight, so it just chuffs away. It's an inanimate object, but it is alive in a way no cigar could ever be. If handled correctly, painting should do what nature doesn't do. Guston explains how he could look out and see the trees blowing, wind moving, and things are happening. I don't have to duplicate that. But what I don't see is a single form that's vibrating away constantly, forever and ever. We are on the edge of recognition. Buildings are rounded, soft, animated, as if about to twitch or bounce. The colour is hard to place. Is there light? Is there shadow? Or just an outline of a white cloud in a pink sky? This is the new kind of ambiguity Guston was searching for, an ambiguity that he hadn't even dreamt of. What would happen if I did paint a simple object, like a book, or a hand, or a shoe? There is something about the way these banal objects are painted. Guston is able to abandon all notions of art and produce something he feels has nothing to do with thought. He gleefully describes them as looking like graffiti, like public toilet drawings. He turns crudity into an art form by producing paintings that look like they are made by someone who doesn't know what they are doing. But the thing is, he does know what he is doing. Guston has found a way to communicate what he is seeing, thinking, feeling, hearing, and remembering by using a personal set of painted hieroglyphics, conjured over time and finally allowed to stay. The most strange and unsettling images are those of the Ku Klux Klan. With their cartoon-like quality, they almost escape recognition, camouflaged by the uniformity of Guston's visual language. Recalling the spontaneous reappearance of the hooded figures in his work, Guston explained how it just came out, and I got very interested. I thought, can I even do that? He had been watching the chaotic and violent scenes of the 1968 Democratic Convention, and later went to his studio and started drawing the hooded figures of the KKK. In 1973, Guston begins to offer an explanation, but cuts himself off. I painted Ku Klux Klan. I'm not interested in the Ku Klux Klan, but I was interested in the hooded figures as representing. It's too simple. I don't have to explain that. I wonder what he would have said, and I wonder if we would have been satisfied. Whereas Guston's earlier descriptions of the KKK from the 1930s dealt with their horrific and brutal actions, 36 years later, he muses on what they are doing before or after their heinous crimes. He shows them drinking, smoking, sitting around, chatting, and even painting. In the studio, a Klansman is either painting a self-portrait or a portrait of another hood, perhaps posing just out of frame. The brush bends as it meets the canvas, but bears no mark. It is held by a giant red hand. The colour highlights its form, sandwiched between the white canvas and gloved hand, which holds a smouldering cigarette. Will it remain unsmoked, or does it somehow meet the lips under the hood? The red of the paint can, palette, hand, rectangle and curtains tore the eye around the canvas. The green blind and blue sky offer some welcome respite from the stifling scarlet hues. It also provides a much-needed exit, which allows the eye to tolerate the crammed space. The painting is signed PG instead of Philip Guston, a signal that this is not a work he wants to sell, but one he wants to keep around so he can return to its lesson. The paintings of the KKK allow us to look in a more complex way. By placing them at leisure, Guston forces us to question if we as human beings have connections to these figures. Do we share anything with them? Surely a member of the KKK cannot also be an artist. They are opposing forces, no? But Guston is smarter than that. If they do all these other things, why can't they paint? And what would they paint? They'd paint themselves. Guston was asked if he was under the hood. Yeah, this occurred to me. Well, it could be all of us. We're all hoods. Artist Sean Locke reflected upon this painting after it was shown as part of a slide talk he was attending as a student in the late 90s. I learned that I'm not seeing what I think I am seeing. Instead of evidence of an artist's racism, I learned that for the first time in my life, I am seeing a white artist, one of the giants of American art, grapple with his own complicity in white supremacy. Guston spoke of how it was no good to paint in the head. What happens is what happens when you put the paint down. You can only hope that you're alert, ready to see. But what do we see? Blackboard is such an odd painting. What are we looking at? A landscape? A poster? A painting? A thought? What is all this space? What was underneath? The paintings are heavy, solid, yet unmade and unfinished in form, as though they have the ability to reshape. Guston described a fascination with the idea that movement could substitute itself with form, that it could somehow put clothes on and become bodied instead of disembodied. City, from 1969, is like a hallucinogenic dream sliding on top of you. It reminds me of Ghostbusters 2, which I saw at the Regal as a child, when the slime comes out of the tap and morphs into a pink, toothless monster. Flatlands, painted in 1970, appears to litter Guston's dictionary of form across the canvas. It feels like a rubbish tip or graveyard for painted objects and marks, which are now left beached as they sink into, sit upon, and hover above an impossible ground. Everything feels as though it has been jostled into space, like actors finding their marks on a stage before the curtain goes up. Guston is always asking where to put the form. It will move all around, bellow out and shrink, and sometimes it winds up where it was in the first place. But at the end, it feels different, and it had to make the voyage. I am a moralist and cannot accept what has not been paid for, or a form that has not been lived through. Whilst looking at this work with a friend and artist, she pointed out the importance of the orange clouds above the sun in the top left-hand corner. The clouds brought everything else into an invisible landscape by creating just a hint of light and distance. I wonder if they were the last thing Guston added. Guston's stroke is so sketch-like. It is not a solid line. It shuffles and searches for the form as it moves forward and then comes back again. His use of black is so unique. It covers outline, shadow, and pure form. The heavy black line at the top and the loop of black underneath in Open Window from 1969 does something to the rest of the forms in the painting. Those lines put pressure on other forms. They shrink some and blow others up. Take them away, and the whole thing loses character, flattens out, loses weight, and becomes a collection of individual objects rather than a unified whole. If Guston ever found a form, shape, colour, or pattern to be inert, to not be acting on another form, then out it would go. The paintings of objects needed the placement of line, learnt in the drawings in Florida. The line drawings on their own are too pure. The object drawings on their own are too full of content. But together, they combine to create a peculiar dialogue between recognisable content and pure form. Since his departure from the art world in 1967, Guston had reinvented a whole new world of form and object that held his fears, concerns, pleasures and vices. I wonder what he thought the reaction might be to the new paintings shown at Marlborough Gallery in New York towards the end of 1970. Well, the reception was hostile. Guston later described how he was chopped up. Except for one writer, all the rest said, well, he's finished. That's the end of that. But it looked pretty good in a way, because it almost matched what I wanted. I mean, I really wanted to be reborn. So maybe they were right. Guston's longtime friend, Morton Feldman, was said to have seen Guston's paintings of clan figures in storage with Brian O'Doherty in 1969, without Guston present. The two of them apparently looked at each other and shook their heads in dismay. Why? Because the work didn't look how they wanted them to look. Artists should only ever serve their own creative curiosity, not some notion of what others think art should be. How contrived. It seems de Kooning was right when he congratulated Guston and told him he was envious of the freedom he had found, a freedom the art world pretends to parade as sacrosanct. But in reality, real freedom can threaten the engineering of commerce upon which the art world is built, and can also threaten to topple philosophies to which some have devoted their life. Guston had grown increasingly cynical. Every time I see an abstract painting now, I smell a mink coat. You know what I mean? The art world had been late to the party, but art students were quickly drawn to Guston's rebellion. He continued to teach throughout the 1970s. The transcript of discussions with students are brilliant. Thoughts arrive, backtrack, erase, and re-emerge like the marks in his paintings. The composition, it's so boring. Like, what's wrong with having an image? And it's absolutely still. It doesn't move. It shouldn't move. Why should they move? Why should it move all around the picture when it should be absolutely still? With a thing, when there's a thing, you find out how banal you are. Then you can move from there. Who did this? This thought dump reminds me of my time at art school, when you had no real idea what your tutor was talking about until you left and you were alone in the studio. Being told by Bruce McLean to stop making art whilst I was at the Slade was one of my most valuable lessons. Guston imparted the same wisdom to his students. You still want to know how to make a picture. I'm not talking about making a picture. I'm talking about having an experience. Guston believed teaching should be about setting fire to people, about making them unhappy and frustrated, but for the right reasons. He declared frustration to be one of the great things in art, and that satisfaction was nothing. To be unsettled, searching, and insecure is the start of something. We must be okay with criticism when it serves us on a road to creative freedom. To be challenged is to be cared about. Guston was extremely productive in the last decade of his life. The canvases were large, the palette remained dominated by red, white, and black, and the forms took on a greater sense of solidity and permanence. In Monument, painted in 1976, legs are just the excuse to create a table-like structure, hooked over one another, giving the sensation of bodily weight. The forms run into and against the picture plane, the ellipses of souls uncomfortably perpendicular to their limbs. On film, Guston confirms the work is all about the exits. A limb lifts to make a whole, glimpsing the continuation of ground and space behind. Our eye and mind can slip through, around the back, imagining the sliding mass in 360 degrees. The anthropomorphic sensation Monument imparts relates to Guston's own experience of leaving the studio. The strangest feeling I have is that when I leave the studio, I have left a person, or something that is a thing, an organic thing that can lead its own life, that doesn't need me anymore. I always think the sign of a good painting is if you come in the next day and you say, "Good morning," greeting it like it's a living organism. You cannot imitate reality. You have to make your own reality. The works continue to have this uncomfortable, ominous quality. The ladder again sees legs hooked over, the sole of a shoe again folded up to face the plane. The crudity is ramped up in the description of a rising bulbous forehead and hair, above an impossible sea that is a surface to support the ladder. The form of dark lines again connect abstraction and image. The currency of shape, pulled from the pure drawings made 10 years earlier, still form the basis of many of the paintings. Black Sea from 1977 is so weird. It's like a giant fleshy lump landing in a swirling romantic landscape. The works start to get darker in painted and emotional tone. As Guston nears the end of his life, they feel sad, lonely, unwell. Together with Musa, he seems to be clinging on. The brush is held tight, the limp legs gathered to prevent the weight of the shoes pulling them off the bed. Heads pressed, a triangle of nailed wood, weighting the cover down. So much pulling in different directions. There is a vulnerability that has grown into the works, and a pain. In Sleeping, from 1977, the eye that closes on the edge of the bed cover provokes a physical reaction when you look at it. The raw, blood-pricked skin, the strands of hair painted like bent nails, the overgrown earlobe of age, the inadequately thin blanket, the weight of the slab-like shoes in bed, which does not feel like a place of rest and comfort. Guston continued to take his own advice throughout his career, that the only technique to learn is the capacity to change. This allowed him to remain free as he continually trod up and down across his life, his paintings, the soles of his shoes, the subject matter caught between the treads. The crazy cat comics of his youth, the light bulb that hung above his head as a child, the masters of the past, the hideous hooded figures of the KKK, the detritus of the studio, his addictions, his wife, this, his life. He opened the door to all of it and was able to let it in without being caught by his own thoughts. There is something about a naked light bulb. Why, I don't know. If I talk about it too much, I'll stop using it. Guston is the embodiment of something seen, felt, and resolved in paint. And it is not only Guston's freedom of expression I admire, it is his reconciliation of object and abstraction. Guston once told students, don't have the idea you're any different than stripes. I think that's right. Stripes are the thing to beat, and perhaps that is the lesson. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. It was totally fascinating.
You're welcome.
Beautifully delivered. Well done. Drink your water.
Look.
I imagine some people might have questions. Can we put the lights back on just so it's a bit easier? Does anyone have any questions? I don't know why I'm doing this for you. You're
No,
really able to
please
talk.
do.
Just slide over here. Right up at the back.
Early in that fantastic presentation, you showed his taking Guernica, removing picture and removing history, and also Picasso's world famous, to me anyway, interpretation of the same title. Was there any interaction as a result of those two works of art between the two artists? Did they influence one another?
I mean, I'm not aware that Guston ever met Picasso. The interesting thing about Guston is he straddles all these amazing periods of art, and I can almost forget that he is making work like that when Picasso is making Guernica. I mean, I think obviously he was a huge influence on Guston, and it is an immature response to Picasso, who's towards the end of his life, and that painting kind of toured around. But I'm not aware that they met, but the Spanish Civil War, I think, was a call to arms for a lot of the liberal left in America, and so they very much felt that it was the cause, and it was something that so many writers and artists were passionate about. So I don't think there was any direct crossover between the two artists, just because I think Guston perhaps didn't have that profile yet, where he would be able to be in the room with Picasso, but he very much was in the room of his paintings, and as I mentioned, he saw them in that private collection, and then when he went to New York, he saw the works in the flesh, but as far as I'm aware, they never actually crossed over, sadly.
You mentioned his addictions. What were his addictions?
Cigarettes and alcohol and women, maybe, because he sadly died when he was 65 in 1980, and of a heart attack, and he'd had one previously, so he kind of knew it was coming. But I think he's always pictured smoking. and I think he was a big drinker, and I think he'd work kind of most of the night. And there was a time during the 60s that he kind of went off with another woman from his wife, who was so much, she was also an artist and a poet, and I think so much his kind of, his meter of reading, if some things were of quality or not. But I think, drinking, like so many of the artists of that day, was a big part. And you see actually in his paintings, he paints himself with these really bloodshot eyes, because it's him looking in the mirror and just seeing the kind of state he's in. And there's, some of you may have seen, there's a film, it's actually on Amazon Prime, of Guston talking. I think it's a few months before he dies, and he does not look like a well man when you think of actually how old he was. So it was, the classic addictions of booze, fags and women.
Rose, excellent podcast. Do you draw inspiration from him in your work?
Yeah, absolutely I do, because I think, like I kind of mentioned, the thing that I so admire about Guston is that thing to be free. And I know lots of people here are artists, and so often I get into the studio and I'm making things and I kind of have these thoughts and I think to myself, oh no, I can't do that because I'm a certain type of artist. And then I think, that's ridiculous, I can do whatever the hell I like. Like, the whole world is open to me. And I think as artists, you kind of actually you build barriers around yourself quite quickly, maybe without even realising it. And then it's to actually just remain open to the fact that you can do anything in whichever medium, in whichever way, and to stay in that place where everything is a possibility is actually much harder than you might think. And so for me, his work, because some of it I respond to in a visual way, I absolutely love it. Other things I'm not so into, but it's more his approach. And for me, the way he talks about painters of the past, I said a little bit about how he talks about Rembrandt and Piero, but how he talks about Goya. And because, as you guys know, I've done these art history talks and I've read a lot of art history. And Guston talks about painters like no art historian can, because he understands what it is to make a work, and he understands that you're talking about this object, but you're forgetting about the person who made the object. And I think that for me is something that I find so inspirational. And when I was doing a conference last year, I was really shocked seeing someone at the National Gallery who was a curator of 15th century European painting. She hadn't even read or knew that Guston wrote about Piero. So it's like, I think there's a big gap in terms of how painting is talked about that I think artists are very good at. And so it's not just his paintings that inspire me, it's definitely the way he talks about painting, and the way he talks to students is brilliant. And I'm sure lots of you are familiar with, there's been 2 books fairly recently published of I Paint What I See, which was published a few years ago, and then the collected writings of Philip Guston. They're brilliant. It's like, I'm doing this talk, I feel like I've gone back to art school, because the way, reading the way he talks. And luckily there's all these transcripts of his conversations, because the Piero piece was the only thing he actually wrote down. Everything else is just the transcript of his conversation. So, yeah.
You said, so in about 1970, this work was obviously kind of generally not well received.
Yeah.
By the time he died, had that shifted, and was there a kind of redemption and acceptance of what he was doing by that point?
There was, yeah. I think in 1980 he had a big show in San Francisco, and it was like the art world establishment had just caught up with the kind of student, because actually a lot of student publications wrote about his work, and then he lived long enough to see himself be re-embraced by the art world. And it's kind of mad, like, you think that he lost friends over the works that he made, because those movements were so politicized. But he did live long enough to kind of see his own renaissance, which is great.
What did he say about that?
I think he was like, fair enough. I think he had removed himself from the art world anyway, and he went off with his wife straight to Rome afterwards and kind of left it all behind. I think it must have hurt him, but I think by that stage he'd already been through so many different changes, and he found it amusing that people were kind of saying to him, why have you gone from abstraction to figuration, whereas a few years before it had been, why have you gone from figuration to abstraction? So it didn't feel that new or radical to him.
You say that he got a lot of influences from the Harlem Renaissance.
By what's so influenced by the Renaissance? The High Renaissance?
Harlem Renaissance.
The what, sorry?
Harlem Renaissance.
What's the Harlem Renaissance? I don't know what it is, sorry.
So it's a rebirth, let's say, artists in Harlem, black artists who
Right.
work and like kind of taking their place by saying that like, I'm an artist and I have the right to make things.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of influence from jazz.
I mean, who knows, in the, like, when we're talking about the 1960s, like, there just wasn't that many artists of colour on the scene, so I wonder how much Guston would have actually known about these other cultures. Like, now we're so much more aware of it. I mean, he doesn't, from my research, I haven't come across him talking about that. That's not to say that he wasn't seeing those kind of other artists. And I think, you know, I don't know if people know, because this show was postponed because of Guston's depictions of the KKK in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd. So, you know, there's kind of so much that has been talked about in terms of Guston's relation to the KKK and how he felt about it. And I think it's always kind of wary to kind of put our own kind of thoughts from where we are in 2023 onto what he would have seen. But he was certainly very active in the 1930s, like the injustices of the KKK, because he was a Jewish man. He was also on their hit list, and you know, he was living in a city that was policed by an organisation that was made up of a lot of members of the KKK. So, you know, he was very much kind of aware of that. And then obviously the state of America in the late 1960s, the civil rights movement. He says, "Who am I just to kind of be in the studio adjusting red to blue? I need to kind of put something of what's going on in the world into my paintings." But in terms of his influence of like movements by other artists of colour, I don't know if that happened or not.
When you look at these earlier abstract expressionist pieces, do you, Rose, think they were abstract expressionists, or do you find them to be figurative?
It's a good question. I think they are kind of figurative. Yeah, and you know, like a lot of artists say, is there such thing as an abstract painting anyway? I don't know, because we're all responding to something, and you know, art history always put these terms on everything, don't they? Art history categorises you're this, abstract expressionism, minimalism, pop art, you know, and I don't think artists ever come out saying, I am an abstract expressionist, I was this and now I'm that. But looking at them in the flesh as well, like, and even someone like Pollock, Guston's work seems much more full-bodied, whereas Pollock almost does seem more patterned, because it's like, you know, I think abstraction in that sense that it's more patterned all the way across, whereas Guston, it feels like something's growing, whereas with other abstract expressionists or those artists, you don't feel it so much. So I think he always, you know, he was always someone who was interested in the image, and I like the fact he doesn't analyse his own history. You know, he doesn't go back to the fact like, oh, I was painting as a child under a hanging light bulb and my father killed himself and I retreated and I was just drawing cartoons. Oh, look, you know, I'm so glad he doesn't go down that road, because he knows it doesn't serve him any purpose, which I think is quite a, you know, possibly a good lesson.
Rose, can you clarify, when Bruce McLean and Slade said to you, stop making art?
It wasn't just me.
So I'm not sure what he meant. What did you take him to mean?
Well, I didn't. Francesca also went to the stage. She can vouch for this. Yeah. No, because it was fantastic, because what it's saying is, you know, you get to an art school and you think you're there to make art, but I think a lot of people have an idea of what they think art is, and that can actually really narrow your creative output. So what he was saying was like, don't think you're here to make art. You can do that after you leave. You're here to investigate. You're here to experiment. You're here to listen to what other people say. You're not here to kind of polish up some kind of art object and then, you know, present it to the world. And I think I said this before, one of the lockdown lectures. I remember at the Slade there's an interim show. It's the year above you. They have a show at the beginning of their second year. And I remember one of my first or second weeks at the Slade going with Bruce McLean, and he was leading all of us students around the show, and he was getting really cross because he was saying, this looks too much like art, that looks too much like art, that looks too much like art. And he was just meaning that there were these things that had somehow been kind of produced, and there was nothing that was questioning, there was nothing that was a bit odd, nothing that kind of didn't neatly fit into a category. And it's a really good point, because at art school, that's the point, to figure stuff out. You can spend your whole life trying to make art after you leave, but the point is that you're experimenting when you're there, and you're just completely open to everything. And I arrived at the Slade being very tight and kind of thought I knew what I was doing, and I was broken apart in the best way. And so him saying, don't make art, it's almost the thought, it's like what Guston's saying, don't have that thought, I'm going to make art. The thought arrives as you work with the medium. That's what he meant.
What do you think he meant when he said he described his work not as making pictures, but creating evidences?
Who, Guston? Well, I guess it's evidence of life, isn't it? It's evidence of someone being there, of something happening. And I think he probably also meant, he says about painting that it's the medium fights back. As everyone here who makes work, you know that you grab something, it touches another surface, that's something that physically happens, and that's actually what you're dealing with. I think he's talking about that, and it's evidence of that, meeting that. Maybe.
Okay. Unless anyone else has any burning questions. Great, okay. I think we'll all give Rose another round of applause.
Oh, thank you.